In 2020, UCLA published a study in Science Advances that most people never heard about. Geneticists Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman analyzed 405 West African genomes, Yoruba, Esan, Mende, Gambian, looking for DNA segments too ancient to have come from modern humans. What they found didn't match Neanderthals, didn't match Denisovans. It came from a completely unknown species that diverged from the human lineage over 1 million years ago. A species with no identified fossil, no name, no grave, only a genetic signal embedded in living people's DNA. They called it the ghost population. It accounts for 2% to 19% of the genomes of those West African populations. The ghost DNA isn't random. It clusters in genes involved in tumor suppression, hormone regulation, and mitochondrial function, variants so beneficial that natural selection drove them to majority frequency. More than half of Yoruba and Mende people carry them today. The Yoruba and the Mende are the same populations that 23andMe identifies as the primary West African source groups for Black American ancestry. The ghost ancestor is not only in West Africa, it's in Black American DNA. It has been there for tens of thousands of years. It is functional, it is measurable, and it is more ancient than anything found in European or Asian genomes. Europeans carried Neanderthal DNA and were told it was part of their ancient heritage. Black Americans carry DNA from something older, stranger, and more mysterious, and most of them have never been told it exists. Drop a comment where you're watching from, hit subscribe. Let's get into it. Let's start with the discovery itself, with exactly what scientists found and how they found it, because the methodology is as remarkable as the result. In 2020, UCLA geneticists Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman published a study in Science Advances titled Recovering Signals of Ghost Archaic Introgression in African Populations. Sankararaman holds appointments in the UCLA Department of Computer Science, Computational Medicine, and Human Genetics, a profile that tells you something about the nature of this work, which sits at the boundary between biology and data science in ways that would have been impossible even 15 years ago. The team analyzed genome-wide data from 405 individuals across 4 West African populations: the Yoruba from Ibadan in southwestern Nigeria, the Esan from southern Nigeria, the Mende from Sierra Leone, and the Gambian people of Western Gambia. They then compared those genomes, region by region, across all 23 chromosomes against the most complete ancient DNA sequences available from Neanderthals, a roughly 44,000-year-old fossil from Eastern Europe, and Denisovans, whose fossil from a cave in Siberia dates to at least 51,000 years ago. What Durvasula and Sankararaman were looking for was simple in concept and extraordinarily difficult in execution: DNA segments in modern West African genomes that look too unusual, too ancient, too divergent to have come from the same modern human lineage as the rest of the genome. Segments that couldn't be explained by normal mutation rates over the last 300,000 years. Segments that looked, in the language of population genetics, like they had introgressed, been introduced from outside, from a population that was not anatomically modern Homo sapiens. They found them across all 4 populations in quantities that nobody had predicted. Here's what the data showed in precise terms. Between 2% and 19% of the genetic ancestry of the Yoruba, Esan, Mende, and Gambian populations traces to an archaic hominin population, an ancient relative of modern humans that the researchers called the ghost population. The specific term ghost is used because this species has never been identified from fossil evidence. No bones, no teeth, no ancient DNA extracted from rock. The entity exists only as a signal in the genomes of living people, a genetic shadow of something that lived in Africa alongside early modern humans, interbred with them, and disappeared from the fossil record without leaving anything behind except the DNA it passed forward. The average contribution across all 4 populations, when the data is aggregated, comes to approximately 6 to 7% of the genome. 6 to 7% of the DNA of the Yoruba and the Menda and the Asan and the Gambian people, populations whose descendants form the core of Black American ancestry, came not from modern Homo sapiens, but from a species of ancient human that science has never formally identified. A species that split from the ancestor of both modern humans and Neanderthals somewhere between 360,000 and 1.02 million years ago. A species older than Neanderthals, older than Denisovans, an entity that lived through the emergence of modern humanity in Africa and left its biological signature in the people it chose to live beside. Sankararaman said it plainly in the aftermath of the study's publication. We don't have a clear identity for this archaic group. That's why we use the term ghost. It doesn't seem to be particularly closely related to the groups from which we have genome sequences. Before we go further, if you're new here, subscribe now. We cover the genetic stories that textbooks have not caught up with yet. This is one of the most significant findings in human evolutionary genetics of the last decade. Subscribe, and let's keep going. Now let's talk about what this ghost population was, as best science can currently determine, and what its DNA is doing in modern genomes today, because this is where the story crosses from remarkable to genuinely destabilizing for the conventional picture of human origins. The ghost population diverged from the common ancestor of modern humans and Neanderthals before Neanderthals themselves diverged. This means it was already a separate species, already walking a different evolutionary path, before the split that produced the ancient European and Asian lineages that eventually gave rise to Neanderthals and Denisovans. The researchers estimate the divergence happened between 360,000 years and 1.02 million years ago, a range so vast that it encompasses a significant portion of the entire history of the genus Homo in Africa. To put that in perspective, modern humans have only existed as a distinct species for approximately 300,000 years. The ghost population may have been a separate lineage before our species existed at all. This is a deeply strange and significant fact. The conventional picture of human evolution has two major archaic species: Neanderthals in Eurasia, Denisovans in Asia and the Pacific, interbreeding with modern humans as they left Africa. Africa itself was assumed to be home to anatomically modern humans whose lineage was, by the time the out-of-Africa migration began, essentially unified into a single, coherent population. The ghost population finding destroys that assumption completely. It tells us that Africa, during the long period of modern human prehistory, was not a single human experiment. It was multiple experiments running simultaneously in different regions of the continent, interacting with each other across landscapes we no longer recognize and in circumstances we have no written record of. The fossil record of ancient Africa is thin. The climate and soil conditions that preserve bones in the caves of Europe and Siberia did not prevail across much of sub-Saharan Africa, and that thinness of the fossil record has long obscured a biological complexity that was there all along. The ghost population lived in that gap, invisible to the fossil record, visible only in the DNA it left behind in the people it interbred with. The introgression, the actual mixing between the ghost population and the ancestors of modern West Africans appears to have occurred approximately 50,000 years ago, though the researchers note it could have happened any time within the last 124,000 years. This timing is significant. It means the interbreeding happened while modern humans were already anatomically modern. It happened while some populations were leaving Africa and encountering Neanderthals in the Near East. It happened at the same geological moment when the major archaic interbreeding events that shaped European and Asian genomes were also occurring. The world of ancient human prehistory was not a simple story of one species replacing another in a clean linear sequence. It was a world in which multiple populations of humans and near humans were living in proximity across the African continent, sometimes competing, sometimes merging, sometimes producing children together who survived and passed on genetic material that is still present in living people's genomes today, still functioning, still influencing biology, still unidentified by any fossil in any museum anywhere on Earth. Now let's be precise about the specific genes the ghost population contributed, because this is the part that turns the finding from fascinating to significant in a way that reaches into the present moment. The researchers did not just identify that ghost DNA was present in West African genomes. They mapped where in the genome that DNA sits and at what frequencies. And when they looked at the specific genetic variants inherited from the ghost population that appear at the highest frequencies in Yoruba and Mande genomes, meaning the variants that spread most widely because they were most useful, the picture that emerged was striking. The ghost population variants appearing at the highest frequency, above 50% in both the Yoruba and Mende populations, include the gene NF1, which functions as a tumor suppressor. It is one of the most studied tumor suppressor genes in the human genome, involved in regulating cell growth and preventing certain types of cancer. Another high-frequency ghost variant involves MTFR2, a gene associated with mitochondrial function and aerobic respiration. Additional high-frequency variants are involved in hormone regulation and male reproductive function. These are not random remnants. These are not genetic noise drifting through the population by chance. Variants that reach frequencies above 50% in a population have done so because natural selection favored them, because individuals who carried them survived better, reproduced more, or both. The ghost population carried genetic material that turned out to be beneficial for its hosts. So beneficial that when it was introduced into the modern human lineage, it spread rapidly. Today, the majority of Yoruba and Mende people carry these ancient variants, and because those populations are the primary West African source groups for Black American ancestry, a significant proportion of Black Americans carry them too. Sharon Browning, a biostatistics professor at the University of Washington who studies archaic introgression, noted after the study's publication that the frequency of ghost DNA in West African genomes tells us that these archaic populations might have had some DNA that did some useful stuff that proved to be useful to the modern population. Now let's place this in its full context, because this is where the connection to history and to Black American identity becomes something more than genetics. This is where the finding stops being just a scientific result and starts being a statement about what humanity is and who has always been at its most ancient and complex center. The conventional Western narrative of human origins has always placed European and Asian populations at the center of the most dramatic genetic story. The one with the ancient interbreeding, the Neanderthal DNA, the archaic ancestry that made modern humans more adaptive, more interesting, more layered. When researchers at the Max Planck Institute sequenced the first Neanderthal genome in 2010, the discovery that Europeans carried Neanderthal DNA was treated as a revelation about the depth and richness of the European genetic inheritance. It was covered by every major news outlet. It became a cultural touchstone. 23andMe and other consumer genetics companies built entire product features around it. Your Neanderthal percentage, your ancient European heritage. The implication was clear even when it was never stated directly. This is what it looks like to have ancient complexity in your DNA. This is the genetic story that matters. The story of African ancestry was framed in almost exactly the opposite terms. Africa was the source, the birthplace of humanity. But the narrative moved on quickly after the out of Africa migration, as if the interesting genetic history happened after people left. Africa produced modern humans, that story said, and then modern humans went out into the world and had all the complex ancient encounters. The ones who stayed were described implicitly, structurally, in the way research was designed and reported as the baseline, the control group, the pure modern human population against which everything else was measured. The ghost population finding inverts that framing so completely that it cannot be restated without changing its meaning. The Yoruba and the Mende, the ethnic groups who contributed most heavily to Black American ancestry, as confirmed by the Micheletti 2020 study at 23 and me and the Bustamante-Tishkoff PNAS study, carry between 2% and 19% DNA from a species of ancient human that is older, more divergent, and more mysterious than either Neanderthals or Denisovans. While Europeans were interbreeding with Neanderthals, a species that had diverged from the human line roughly 700,000 years ago, West Africans were interbreeding with something that had been a separate evolutionary lineage for potentially over 1 million years. While Melanesians were absorbing Denisovan ancestry, a species also roughly 700,000 years diverged, the ancestors of Black Americans were absorbing DNA from a species that nobody has yet named, that left no fossil record, and whose identity remains one of the deepest unsolved questions in the entire field of human evolutionary science. The ghost is older. The ghost is more mysterious, and its genetic contribution to the people whose descendants became Black Americans is not a small, vestigial trace. It is between 2% and 19% of the genome, a contribution that in its upper range exceeds the total Neanderthal content in most European genomes, a contribution that, because the specific variants involved spread to majority frequency through natural selection, has been actively shaping the biology of its carriers for tens of thousands of years. The genetic legacy of that interbreeding did not fade out, it spread. The ghost population's tumor suppressor genes, its mitochondrial function variants, its hormone regulation alleles, they are present today in the majority of Yoruba and Mande people. They are present in significant proportions of Black Americans. They have been inside the Black American genome for the entirety of recorded history, operating silently, influencing biology in ways that science is only now beginning to characterize. History told the story of Black Americans as people without ancient genetic complexity, without archaic heritage, without the deep time biological drama that was reserved for the populations whose descendants built European civilization. The genome says otherwise. The genome says the ancestors of Black Americans were interbreeding with an ancient species when that species had already been separate from the main human lineage for longer than Neanderthals had even existed. The ancient story of Africa and of the people descended from Africa is not simpler than the European or Asian story. It is more complex, it is older, and it has always been there in the data waiting to be read. Here's the summary of what the science has established. In 2020, UCLA researchers Durvasula and Sankararaman published the strongest evidence yet that 4 West African populations, the Yoruba, Esan, Mende, and Gambian, carry between 2% and 19% of their genome from a ghost archaic hominin. This species diverged from the ancestor of modern humans and Neanderthals between 360,000 and 1.02 million years ago. It has no identified fossil. It has no name. It exists only in the DNA of its descendants who are predominantly West African, whose diaspora includes tens of millions of Black Americans, and whose ghost ancestor is therefore present right now in a significant proportion of the 40+ million Black Americans living in the United States today. The genes this ghost population contributed are not inert. They are functional. They are at high frequency because natural selection kept them. They involve cancer suppression, cellular energy production, and hormonal regulation. They are part of the biological toolkit of a population that history told had no ancient complexity worth discussing. That history lied. The data has been correcting it since 2020, and the correction is not a footnote. It is not a caveat buried in a supplementary section of a scientific paper. It is the headline. The people whose ancestors built the foundation of Black American ancestry were interbreeding with a species of ancient human, more divergent and more ancient than anything found in European or Asian genomes, and the genetic legacy of that encounter is present, functional, and measurable in Black Americans alive today. The bones don't lie. The genome doesn't forget. And the ghost ancestor hidden inside Black American DNA, this unnamed, unfossiled, deeply ancient relative of all modern humans, has been there for tens of thousands of years, older than any civilization that history chooses to teach, older than any written record, older than the concept of race itself, which was invented in the 17th century by people who needed a scientific-sounding reason to classify some human beings as less than human. The ghost ancestor preceded that classification by 1,000,000 years. It existed long before any system of human hierarchy was imagined, and it will outlast them. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Drop a comment below. Tell us what hit hardest, because comments on this one tend to run deep. Because next week we're going even deeper into what Africa's genetic complexity means for the entire story of human evolution, and why the continent history called the simple starting point is actually where the most ancient, most layered, and most unresolved chapters of the human story are still being discovered and still being written. Subscribe now so you are there when we drop it.